Greetings, friends, and mostly enemies. It's good to be back. Sorry, the uploads are still intermittent, guys. I'm almost wrapped up with my dad's estate, so hopefully once that is all said and done, videos will be weekly again. Be patient with me. Still working on that. In other news, hey, did you know that me and my friend Caitlin have a merch store where you can get this and other awesome designs? On the screen, you see all this cool, handy-dandy stuff that you can use to express your dissatisfaction with the state of humanity. And frankly, I expect you to go buy it because it's awesome and you would look awesome in it. So you can go there if you want to support me and my friend Cait, pick out a cool design and whatnot. Also, there's going to be a promotion for my book. I'm going to be partnering with BookBub to do a discounted sale. I'm working out the logistics of that, but that's going to be coming soon in preparation for the release of the second book, which will be October. Are you excited? I'm excited. It's really good. You guys are going to love it. Yeah, just waiting on the final cover art and got to approve the final edit and then start getting everything all wrapped up and nicely put in a bow. And it's probably going to be ready for release mid-October is probably where I'm shooting for right now. So there's going to be a leading up to Halloween, pre-sale, and all that stuff. And the second book kind of has some existential horror elements, so it fits right in. Also, if you guys didn't know, there's a second channel that me and my friend Cait are working on. That's going to be part of her book release, is a bunch of content going to be instantly showing up for being available on that channel. There's going to be clips from our weekly show that we do, comic strip, a bunch of stuff, slice of life. That's just kind of me and her's miscellaneous channel where anything that doesn't belong on her channel or my channel goes on that channel. So if you want more of my absurdity, a comic strip that's going to be completely original, and all kinds of other fun stuff, go check out if you're feeling adventurous. Link in the description. Alright, so with that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, let's get on to the reason most of you are probably here, which is the content of the video. You know, you might want that at some point. So, conflict. The archetypes of conflict. How we do conflict well in a story. Why we need conflict in our story. These are things that as writers, it's very important that we understand. A good story has conflict. Period. One of the primary reasons that so many stories fall away into the ether, never to be talked about again, is because the conflict is either non-existent or it sucks. So, we're going to talk about conflict today, why it's so important, and how you can put good conflict in your story. Let's do it. So, of course, everyone knows about the 4 archetypes of conflict, or at least you definitely should. If you have no idea what the 4 conflict archetypes are, and the secret archetype that I'm going to discuss at the end of the list, then you probably shouldn't be writing, because you still have a lot left to learn. And I'm not saying that to disparage you or put you down. I'm just saying if you don't know even the 4 conflict archetypes, there's probably a lot more academia you need to consume to have a well-rounded understanding of storytelling so you're capable of telling a good story. So, without further ado, let's get into them. Man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self, man versus God. And then the secret, kind of hidden conflict archetype that no one talks about, but that runs through every other conflict archetype, is good versus evil. Good versus evil is a common thread that runs through every conflict you ever see in storytelling. There's always a side to root for. Sometimes the side might not necessarily be, strictly speaking, morally good. But in any story that anyone remembers where there's a conflict that's central to the story, there's a side you were rooting for, wasn't there? There's a side you wanted to win. Because that side was, for some reason, more palatable to you than the other side. So, good versus evil is something that pops up in every other archetype. And you need to understand why good versus evil is so innately appealing and why it runs through every other archetype. So we'll talk more about that later. For now, let's talk about the 4 standard archetypes. So as I said, conflict is central to the human experience. It's quintessential and inescapable. And I personally list the conflict archetypes here in the order of scale and magnitude that I think they assume, okay, in a proper hierarchy of interest level, literary quality, philosophical weight, those kinds of things, okay? So we start with man versus man. Now, a lot of people like to break this down and have more expanded categories, but really, I think those are just nitpickers, busybodies who want to break things down to a more simply digestible format because they have trouble grasping big concepts all at the same time. We don't need to break this down to man versus society, man versus religion, man versus government, man versus this, man versus that. It's all man versus man, okay? Every single type of conflict where any number of people on this side and any number of people on this side are going at each other for any reason, that all fits into man versus man. So man versus society is man versus man. Man versus religion is man versus man. Man versus government is man versus man, okay? What we need to understand about man versus man is that almost always there is a good and a bad side. Now, especially when we start talking about large groups, it's almost inescapable that there's going to be some bad people on the good side and some good people on the bad side, because evil likes to hide in good, and sometimes good is taken in and fooled by evil. So, you can find good people doing bad things because they're simply being tricked, and you can find evil people doing good things because they have a mask on and they're trying to fit in for various reasons. But most often in our stories, we typically have a protagonist with a small group of friends that are combating some larger group, and usually it's a matter of principle and morality. So usually we have our protagonist on the side of good and the other group of humans on the side of bad, evil. And that's just kind of how most storytelling is done, because it's so fundamentally relatable. We've all been in that scenario in real life ourselves. It's kind of one of those unavoidable aspects of human life. And that's what lends so much weight to it. That's what makes it so relatable, because everyone has had that experience of being oppressed by what they perceive to be evil. Now, an important caveat to mention in man versus man is that sometimes there is no evil side, and sometimes there is no good side. There are a lot of really good stories with sympathetic villains, or 2 evil parties duking it out, or 2 good parties who have a friendly rivalry. These stories exist, and they can be very compelling and very well told, and have a huge impact on you. But I would argue that if you're going to do a story where there's no good versus evil thread, then you need to make sure the rest of your story has enough intrigue and depth to hold attention without that fundamental aspect in it. Now, an important thing to mention as a closing note for man versus man is any man versus man conflict you write is going to be limited by the natural limits of mankind. Unless, of course, you're writing science fiction or fantasy, then you can often play with, expand, and break the natural limits of mankind. But if you're writing something that's based in reality, contemporary fiction, or historical fiction, you're limited by the limits of mankind, where man versus man is concerned. Next. And of course, we have man versus nature. And this can be man versus animal, man versus weather, man versus disease, man versus natural disaster. Anything that's a naturally occurring phenomenon. And something that I think a lot of people don't take into account, and a lot of people wrongfully do, is when we conceptualize humanity and nature, we separate the two. And what it's very important to remember is that human beings are part of nature. We evolved here naturally. We weren't dropped off by aliens. We've been part of this planet just as long as everything else. We're just as much a part of nature as everything else. And so, in a lot of ways, when we talk about man versus nature, what we're really talking about is man versus himself. Mankind harming himself in ways that he doesn't yet fully understand, because I think you could argue we're comparatively still a young species, and we're trying to grow our understanding and gain a universal understanding where the overwhelming majority of people understand how their actions affect the rest of humanity and the planet. And so that's an aspect of man versus nature that I think gets explored, but I think it should be explored more and in more subtle and convincing and uniting ways, because we as storytellers have the power to unite people under ideas, especially ideas that have universal truth to them. But often when storytellers try to tell these stories, they come off as really, really preachy and condescending, because there's so much modern politics wrapped up in this conflict archetype. And it really is a shame that it's become politicized to the point that it has, because the fact that man is here to be a good steward of the rest of nature is something that should be universally agreed upon. I don't see why that's ever up for debate. Often I think the debate comes into, well, how do we act as good stewards? And that's unfortunately more often a sticky subject. Now, for one of my personal favorite archetypes, maybe my personal favorite, it's between this and number 4, is man versus self. When we talk about man versus self, we talk about a man versus all of his inner demons. We talk about a man struggling to be the best possible version of himself despite the world around him. Or a woman, when we say man, we mean mankind. So when we talk about the conflict archetype of man versus self, we are talking about something that is potentially infinite in scale. Because your demons can be as vast and endless as human imagination itself. And your desire for good and to be a good person and to do the right thing can be equally infinite. And unfortunately, a interesting little quirk of humanity is sometimes we can truly, in our hearts, have the best possible intention and do the most monstrous things. So, man versus self to me is an infinitely complex, deep, and endless wellspring of good content and good storytelling. Someone with a good imagination and an interesting aspect of man versus self, in my opinion, will always write a good story, because I think there can be no end to the exploration of ways in which humanity continuously battles itself at the most fundamental level inside our own hearts. Was that deep enough for you? And so finally, we have man versus God. And I think man versus God can be expanded to encompass just about anything that is inescapable or beyond human scale. So we can have man versus actual God. We can have man versus mythological creature. We can have man versus superior alien race. When we talk about man versus God, it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual literal God. It can be anything that is beyond the scope of man to deal with. And I personally think that this archetype is the only one that can truly compete with man versus self in terms of its philosophical weight and implications and and literary potential. Because when we talk about man versus God, we talk about man being forced to rise to an occasion in a way that nothing else can possibly demand. We talk about man trying to step up to the plate and transcend himself, trying to become more than what he is at a fundamental level, trying to evolve physically, spiritually, mentally into a higher level of being so that he can now compete on this stage where previously he was an ant. Man vs. God, to me, fundamentally, is a story of a man looking at the impossible and saying, "Hold my beer." And this is why it's so interesting. This is why so many man vs. God stories have such a hard-hitting, gripping aspect to them. Lord of the Rings is a great example of this. We have the hobbits, okay, lowest of the low by some regards in the sentient species, weak, small, unadvanced, and they end up competing against what amounts to a demigod and winning. That's a good man versus God story, where two hobbits just said, "Fuck you," and took down an evil Mac Daddy of doom and gloom. A little bit more contemporary of an example would be Gurren Lagann, where humans, through sheer force of will, evolve into this god-level force where they destroy a god-level threat, where they truly transcend the limits of space and time and begin to do things that we as humans exist now truly can comprehend by the way it's depicted in the anime. If you like anime, or if you're at least open to the idea of watching a few, I would highly recommend checking out Gurren Lagann. Once you get past all the, cultural differences of Japanese anime and some of the silliness, it's truly a fantastic story of man versus God. Now finally, we get to the secret archetype, the one that no one ever talks about, good versus evil. The thing about good versus evil, and the reason it's so important to talk about it, is because evil truly exists, and a lot of people forget that. I've genuinely met people in my life that think there's no such thing as an evil person, and that's just stupid. Okay, evil absolutely exists, evil people exist, and evil can manifest anywhere. It's not just humans. You can have evil nature, and you can have evil God. And that's not me saying that I believe the one true God is evil, okay? I'm saying that sometimes things that are beyond human understanding act in malicious and malevolent ways. Now, good versus evil, because it is more so a fundamental thread, a aspect of existence itself, it runs through everything else. And so we can see good versus evil in any of the other archetypes. We can see evil man versus good nature. Okay, that's a story that's been told quite a bit, as I've mentioned before. Fern Gully, Captain Planet are two very well-known examples. And if you, again, think about how humans are actually part of nature, you can look at something like Atlas Shrugged and see how that could be man versus nature, because it's man destroying himself, and he's part of nature. So you can kind of add layers of complexity and thinking to certain stories if we just remember that fundamentally man is part of nature. You can have good man versus evil self, and that's a great example of man versus self, where you're trying to be a good person, you're trying to do the right thing, but in your heart you're truly a despicable person and you don't want to be anymore. Those are great stories, and we see that story manifest in so many good stories that have been told throughout human history, from classic plays all the way into contemporary movies. I mean, there's just thousands of examples. This is one of those times where my brain is so flooded with the concept that I can't grasp a specific example right now, Like, the only one that's coming right now to mind is, like, Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where he started out as being a genuinely evil character, but he was surrounded by good for so long that he came to understand his own folly. Spike has a great character arc. There is, as I said earlier, evil god versus good man. There's evil man versus good god. Good God, yo! All of these are valid, and any combination of these are valid. And something you can do, you can always add a side to your conflict. Conflict is typically depicted as a dichotomy, one side versus the other. But when we add in a third party, it can get much more complex and interesting, and we can always add in more parties if we want to keep adding complexity and layers and depth to the story. But I think that very often when we have a good and an evil versus another evil, we see a layer of complexity come in there that is so interesting and so universally understandable, because in our own lives, many of us have experienced where we have to work with something that we find to be distasteful, gross, evil, to get rid of something that was even worse. That's again an almost universally understood concept. And so you can always add a great layer of depth to your story by adding in that third party. So, in closing, your story needs conflict. It's central to the human experience. It's inescapable if you're living in the real world. And I think the best stories often have two or more types of conflict. Man versus man is often needed to make the circumstances of your story more realistic. Man versus self is needed to make your characters believable. Man versus nature is often a great way to randomly inconvenience your heroes. And man versus God lets us elevate our stories to new epic heights. And finally, good versus evil is something that adds universal understanding and morality to our stories. So when we employ each one of these archetypes in a fashion that it is properly applied and adds layer and depth, then our stories take on life of their own. Our stories gain a pulse and breath, and they come alive. But you have to use the conflict properly. You have to depict it adequately, and it has to be believable. Good characters have internal conflict. That's man versus self. Good protagonists butt heads with other humans. Man versus man. Oftentimes, nature doesn't cooperate with us, and it inconveniences us. Man versus nature. Oftentimes, we run into circumstances that are completely out of our control, and we have to deal with them. Man versus God. And if you ever stand for anything in your life that is even remotely good, you will personally run into man versus evil. These things are universal. They are inexorable. You can't ignore them or get rid of them. And if you try to write around them, if you try to come up with a story that has no type of conflict whatsoever but somehow is still engaging, I'm not going to say it can't be done, but when you find that story or when you write it, you send it my way. So, again, guys, sorry that uploads are being infrequent right now. Like I said, I'm dealing with some stuff, but I've almost got some of it wrapped up. I really appreciate you sticking around and being patient with me and all that good stuff. Garden of Lies, available now, as you all know. A sale is going to be announced soon in partnership with BookBub, hopefully, if it gets approved, as a way of hyping up sales for the release of the sequel, which is going to be in October. Check out the second channel with me and Cait, which is going to be going live in a big way. I don't have a hard date on that yet, but hopefully it's going to be around the time of the launch of her first book and my second book. And if you want to support me and my friend Cait, go to our merch store, buy a tea or two. They make great friends, great conversation starters, and it's a good way of sending a message. Until next time, my friends, be well. Welcome to Garden.